Stop. May I have your attention? Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce our luncheon speaker, Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, London. Martin's background in journalism is, of course, impressive to say the least. His many awards include the Commander of the British Empire for services for financial journalism, the Ludwig Erhard Prize for economic commentary, the Ischia International Journalism Prize, and many, many others. He has authored several books, and a new one, I happen to know, is on the way. Globally, he is regarded as one of the most influential economics journalists of our time. Foreign Policy Magazine and Prospect have named him in their top 100 lists of global thinkers, I think, for a long time. Larry Summers has called him the world's preeminent financial journalist. And Paul Krugman has described him as having a keen sense of observation, a level head, and an open mind. How do you do that, Martin? Martin and I came to know each other in Davos in the late 90s. I think it was. He's always correcting me. It's always a delight whenever we meet again. Martin, you have the floor, electronically speaking.
So, first of all, I hope you can all hear me. I'm really sorry not to be with you. I'm not really sorry to miss the flights across the Atlantic. One of the great relief of the last near 2 years has been not doing that. But this is a gathering I would really like to have been part of. And so you'll have to do with this disembodied self. What I'm going to do, and I've been told very sternly it'll be about 20 minutes or maybe 22, but I'll be pretty close to that, is to do something no sane individual should ever do, which is to bring out the highlights of a book I'm just completing, which is on the title of The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And what I'm going to offer you is approximately 1.4% of it. So you will understand this is going to be very crude. I would also like to stress that this is a work in progress, but basically finished. And it's taken me quite a number of years, and my views have developed a lot in that time, and quite a lot from what I used to think in the past. So let me start then now. I'm going to start with a quotation, one of two quotations which were particularly influential for me from the great Greek philosophers. And this is from Aristotle's Politics. And he said, "It is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one which operates through the middle people," by which he meant the middle classes, "and also that those states in which the middle element is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two together, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run democratic constitution," which is what he meant by the word politeia. In a liberal democracy, a democracy characterized by individual civil rights, the rule of law, and respect for both the rights of the losers and the legitimacy of the winners, fair elections have to determine who holds power. Attempts by a head of government and state to subvert an election or overturn the vote are treason. Yet that is clearly what Mr. Trump attempted to do both before and after last year's presidential election. He failed. Decent and brave people ensured that, but this story has, I think, only just begun. Trump continues to hold the loyalty of his party's base and so to control its leaders. Meanwhile, such conservative stalwarts as Liz Cheney have been defenestrated. Her crime, stating that Trump's big lie, that the outcome of the election was a big lie, is a big lie. The fact that Trump was lying is not news. What is news is that shorn of public office, as he is, Trump continues to define truth for the great majority in his party. There is a well-known German word for a political organization in which the duty of members is loyalty to a leader who alone defines what is true. It is Führerprinzip. The amateurish Stop the Steal movement of the last election has now morphed into a well-advanced project. One part of this has been to remove officials who stopped Trump's effort to reverse the results in 2020. But the main effort and the main aim is to shift responsibility in emergencies for deciding electoral outcomes to state legislatures. The Trump phenomenon is, alas, not unique, though it is far and away the most important for those of us interested in the future of democracy. Freedom in the World 2021, published by the independent US watchdog Freedom House, published, in fact, in February of this year, reported that we had just had the 15th consecutive year of decline in the global health of liberal democracy. The democratic recession, quote unquote, noted by the distinguished scholar Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institute in Stanford about 15 years ago, is now coming close to a democratic depression. This decline has occurred in all regions of the world, not least in the democracies that emerged after the end of the Cold War. But most significantly, it is also observable and very clearly observable in core Western democracies, and above all the US, far and away the most important of all democracies, indeed the country that in essence ensured the survival of democracy in the 20th century. So let me go back now from that opening to my view of how democratic capitalism was born in the first place. It's a very extraordinary phenomenon because democracy is, in fact, as you will all know, a very rare phenomenon in the history of organized human societies. According to the Polity4 database, a well-known database on such matters, there were no democracies 2 centuries ago. Even where republican institutions did exist, the franchise was extraordinarily restricted on the grounds of sex, race, and wealth. But then successively in the 19th century, franchises began to be widened, and slowly in fits and starts, universal suffrage democracy began to emerge to cover, by 1990, about half of the world's countries, at least notionally. So why did that happen? Why in the last 2 centuries did liberal democracy become, universal suffrage democracy, become a norm for the government of civilized countries? And the answer, I believe, lies with the emergence of a vital but difficult marriage between a liberal economy and democratic politics. Market capitalism and democracy are, in my view, what I think of as complementary opposites. The market economy and universal suffrage democracy both reject, and this is crucial, the notion of ascribed hereditary status, which has been characteristic of almost all organized human societies. They both embrace the idea that people are entitled and allowed to decide really vital things for themselves in their own lives and in the lives of their societies. Market capitalism rests on ideals of free labor, individual effort, reward for meritorious performance, and of course, all this should be underpinned by the rule of law. Democracy rests on the ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making the law. There is a clearly complementary values. Historically, the market economy brought, of the last 2 centuries, some profound changes: urbanization, the rising demand and supply of an educated workforce, the emergence of the working class as a powerful political force, and a new opportunity for a positive sum politics. In complicated ways, I argue, these created necessary conditions for the emergence of democratic politics as the least contentious, indeed the only satisfactory way of running the polity that corresponded to these economic and social realities. Democracies have also rested on the existence of an independent citizenry, citizens who are independent in their lives to a significant degree. Without private property and markets accessible by all, an independent citizenry cannot exist. And to the extent that those qualities don't exist, the independence of the citizenry is highly compromised, as of course has long been the case on racial lines in the US. This then is why the market economy and liberal democracy are complementary. Yet they are also, in vital respects, opposites. Capitalism is cosmopolitan. The democratic state is territorial. The market is the domain of exit. Democracy is, of course, the premier domain of voice. The market economy is naturally inegalitarian, the principle of $1, one vote. Democracy is egalitarian, one person, one vote. Tensions between capitalism and democracy will inevitably emerge in theory and in practice. Now, if the economy fails to serve the interests of the great majority as they perceive it, the sense of shared citizenship will fray and demagogues will emerge, as Plato warned in great detail in the Republic. Democracy may then be transformed into what he himself described, a form of plebiscitary dictatorship, which in practice meant the arbitrary rule of one person. In sum, as Aristotle insisted, the political weight of people close to the middle of the income distribution must be dominant, must be immensely potent if democracy is to endure. So what has gone wrong with this synthesis of complementary opposites? I argue that the core of this is large rises in inequality and the deteriorating prospects of the old, respectable working and middle classes in core democracies. And with those changes, the foundations of democracy have been undermined. In particular, the pervasive fear of downward mobility in many people in these categories has created profound status anxiety, and with it, deep political cynicism. The latter features, status anxiety and political cynicism, have then been diverted and above all exploited by skilled propagandists of the kind who always emerge into cultural and racial resentments. And this is particularly true in ethnically diverse societies. This phenomenon is not new. To give the most salient example, it has long been the foundation of the political culture of the American South, and it was, of course, the foundations of European fascism as well. Those resentments have also been greatly aggravated, in my view, by the emergence of a large class of university-educated clerics dedicated to a progressive but also profoundly divisive cultural and racial politics. And we are seeing pretty well everywhere a war between the identity army of the left against the identity army of the right. In my view, the emergence of the new media, long emphasized, have merely facilitated these trends, but they have not created them. A big question is what has happened to create this status anxiety, notably in people who did not go to college. In the long run, I believe the important phenomena have been a long period of stagnant real wages and incomes in the middle of the distribution and below, rising inequality, declining social mobility, deindustrialization, and job insecurity. The most painful indicator of the social dysfunction has surely been falling life expectancies among non-college educated white people in the US, noted by Ann Case and Angus Deaton in their seminal study of deaths of despair. To my distress, this same phenomenon may also now be emerging in the UK. As Raghuram Rajan argued in a book he published about 10 years ago, easy credit papered over many of these trends. But that, of course, blew up in the global financial crisis. The scale and visibility of the crisis, a financial crisis, is not something one can miss. And subsequent rescue of the banks and bankers convinced many that the elite was corrupt and incompetent. And these forces together, in my view, is why the old Republican establishment became so ripe for a populist takeover. But in truth, what has happened has discredited the establishment in both of the main parties of the US, as it did in different ways in the UK at the time of Brexit. The shift towards the skill-intensive sectors and technologies, deindustrialization of the labor force, globalization, and the rise of China were themselves the product of powerful external economic forces, difficult to control. Yet there is also, in my view, substantial evidence of the emergence of a rentier form of capitalism with weakening competition, rising forces of monopoly, and unbridled self-seeking by many corporate executives. Furthermore, the role of money in politics, not exclusively, but particularly in the US, has been allowed to erode the tax base and even more the effectiveness of regulation. There is substantial evidence too that the policy preferences of the majority of Americans are frequently put aside in favor of those in elite positions. No wonder people are cynical about politicians. They are thought to be for sale, and of course they are. Again, this is true in my country as in yours. So how does this democratic capitalism, whose fate seems so concerning to me, fit in today's world? In an important book, Branko Milanovic argued that capitalism is alone, that it has won. No other credible system for organizing production and exchange in a complex modern economy now exists. But then it raises the question, what sort of capitalism has won? Is it what Milanovic calls liberal capitalism and I call democratic capitalism? Or is it what he calls political capitalism and I call authoritarian capitalism? Furthermore, there are in fact two forms of authoritarian capitalism in the world today. The most frequent version derives from what I've just discussed, the hostile takeover of democracies, often from within. The would-be autocrat eats out democracy from inside. Features of such regimes almost universally include a narrow circle of trusted servants, promotion of members of the family, and power ministries, to use the Soviet term, that are overwhelmingly loyal to the leader personally. Plutocrats may have supported the gangster in charge, but ultimately, as the regime evolves, they survive only as cronies. The other challenger is, of course, bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism. A communist bureaucracy operating a capitalist economy can be self-disciplined, long-sighted, technocratic, and rational. Even so, bureaucratic capitalism also suffers from the vices of authoritarianism, especially the tendency towards corruption and crony capitalism. These failings will damage both the economy and political legitimacy. Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive clearly derived from his conviction that this was so, and I strongly suspect he was completely right. Bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism is a significant challenger to Western democratic capitalism. Yet we must not despair. Liberal democracy has come through many challenges over the past century. Just remember the state of Europe in May 1940 or its deep post-war division. More fundamentally, I remain convinced that it is the right system, or at least the least bad one. It rests on a magnificent belief in the right of people to make up their own minds and lead lives they choose within societies whose decisions are taken with the active and engaged consent of the governed. So let me conclude by discussing renewing democratic capitalism. The renewal of democracy and capitalism must, in my view, be animated by a very simple, old, and powerful idea, that of citizenship. If democracy is to work, we cannot think only as consumers, workers, business owners, savers, or investors. We have to think as citizens. And citizenship must have three aspects: loyalty to democratic, political, and legal institutions, and the values of open debate and tolerance that underpin them, concern for the ability of fellow citizens to live a fulfilled life, and the desire to create an economy that allows citizens to flourish. So what might a return to the idea of citizenship mean in today's challenging global environment? It does not mean that democratic states should have no concern for the welfare of non-citizens. Very far from it. It does not mean that states should cut themselves off from free and fruitful exchange with outsiders, with other countries, the rest of the world. It does not mean that states should not cooperate closely with one another in order to achieve shared goals. Very far from it. There are things it clearly, in my view, does mean. It means that the first concern of a democratic state is the welfare of its citizens. It means that every child in the country should have the chance to acquire an education that allows them to participate as fully as possible in the life of a high-skilled modern economy. It means that every citizen should have the support needed to thrive, even if burdened by ill luck of illness, disability, and other misfortunes. It means that every citizen should be free from abuse, physical and mental. It means that workers should also be able to cooperate with other workers in order to protect fundamental rights to decent treatment. It means that citizens should regard it as their duty to pay taxes sufficient to sustain such a society. It means that corporations will recognize that they have fundamental obligations to the societies that make their existence possible. It means that citizens are entitled to decide who is allowed to come and work in their countries and who is entitled to share the rights of citizenship with them. It means that politics must be susceptible to the influence of all citizens, not mainly to that of the wealthiest. It means that policy should seek to create and sustain a vigorous middle class while ensuring a viable and valid safety net for all. It means that all citizens, whatever their race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, are entitled to equality of treatment as individuals. The world has changed too profoundly for nostalgia to be a sane response. Be it on the right or the left, going back to the 1950s or 1960s is a ludicrous fantasy. Yet some things surely remain the same. Human beings must act collectively as well as individually. Acting together within a democracy means acting and thinking as citizens. If we do not do so, democracy will fail, and it may fail quite soon. It is our duty, in my view, to ensure that it does not. Thank you for listening.
So we do have time to take a few questions, Martin, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I expected people to throw buns at me.
This is Catherine Venice. So a lot of authoritarian experts, academic experts, have been warning us for several years now that the US is going headlong down a path towards authoritarianism. If that's the case, if Trump returns to power in 2024, which economy in the world right now do you think is going to be the most relevant example for us to be thinking about in terms of what we should be expecting future business life to look like under that scenario?
Well, the United States is a very lucky country because, and I think I'm not being facetious, only being a little facetious, in that of all the would-be authoritarians who have come to power in various countries around the world, Donald Trump seems to me among the most incompetent. And he would be operating within the context of the best established structure of independent legal and other institutions, as well as the federal constitution, that such states have had. So I think a great many aspects of US operation, law, and so forth would survive pretty well. Unless it goes on not just for 4 years, but basically it becomes an hegemony, that the corruption of the electoral system and other aspects is so great that essentially it becomes a one-party state. I can't comment on that. But if that doesn't happen, in 4 years, I would expect him to put in place in the Department of Justice and in other relevant organizations like the Inland Revenue Service, the FBI, and so forth, the power ministries, people who will use these organizations. He will find people who know how to make it work for them, to essentially to persecute those who cause trouble for him. And those are very, very powerful instruments of coercion. And for a lot of people, they will be fairly effective. I've been astonished how in sundry countries it has been possible to use the legal system. Hungary is an example, Turkey is an example, in this way, essentially to corrupt and warp the independence of business people and so forth, as well as other institutions. How far that will go in the US, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, it would be an idiot for me to say, but I have a suspicion that the path in the US, if it goes this way, will be long, winding, difficult, and not a simple linear development of the type we've seen in other countries. The potential resistance in the US is obviously vastly greater than anyone else. So I don't think there is any exemplar out there what would happen. I have been using warnings, but if you have somebody in power who knows how to employ people who know how to use relevant departments for their purpose, then they can do quite a bit of damage. And if they're succeeded by people younger, more determined, more ruthless, and there are plenty of them around who also obtain power over a long period, they can warp a constitution completely. My favorite example, but it is of course a rather weird one, is the reminder that the Roman Republic moved into being the Roman Empire without the change of a single relevant institution in what had been the most successful Republican experiment in history before that of the US.
Hi, yeah. So in the last 15 years, we've seen a profound shift in terms of social connectivity that's been enabled by technology. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on popularism and how popularism might play a role in evolving democracies.
I presume you mean populism, or anyway,
Yes, populism.
I think of it as populism. Well, that's a whole chapter of my book, and what I've given here is a tiny bit of it. But I use the word demagoguery. I think it's much better than populism, but then that's my terrible classical background. That's why I use demagogue for populist. Now, the populism, as you of course know, is very old. It's not new. It was a phenomenon in Athens. It was a phenomenon in the Roman Republic. It's basically a phenomenon in every electoral system I'm aware of. It was in Florence and so forth. So it's not new, and it certainly didn't depend on modern media, which is why, though I don't have time to go through this now, I've become pretty convinced that we exaggerate the influence of modern media. It's not new. But populism, in my view, having read an enormous amount on this, but it's not a field of my expertise, but I have a chapter on it, can be seen in two different ways. So what you might call populism light and populism serious. Populism light is the most classic examples of that, and of which there have been many versions in American history, which I've been reading about, fascinating, is essentially anti-elitism. The view of the majority of the people that the elites are screwing them, which is, in my view, often true. And populism light is, as it were, looking for leaders or a leader who will use existing institutions to rebalance the workings of society and the economy in the interests of the majority. So it's the majority against what are seen as narrow elites. And this can often play out in ways that are actually profoundly fertile and fortunate. It's what you want to happen. The second version of populism, which is, I think, what you're seeing in a number of countries, including the US, is what, and I rely very much on his writing, Jan Werner Müller of Princeton describes as anti-pluralist populism. This is populism that says we, and we alone, are the real people, a phrase that actually Donald Trump has used, and everybody else who doesn't vote for us is not part of the real people. They are in fact enemies of the people, to quote a famous headline in the Daily Mail after Brexit. So once you get a populism which is deeply anti-pluralist, that says we and we alone are the real people, and the other people are not part of the real people, they are ex hypothesi, a priori traitors, then you have a justification for authoritarianism. You have a justification, either it could be majoritarian authoritarianism or minoritarian authoritarianism. It varies a bit, but it is the sort of argument that you will find is used by every one of the significant authoritarian leaders of today. Orban, Erdogan, they all use this perspective. Once you end up with that form of populism, you're sliding towards, I don't want to overdo this, but I think you're sliding towards a version of fascism. Unfortunately, echoes of that view, that perception of how electoral politics should work and who is a legitimate player in it, are clearly present now in the US, and also, though to a smaller degree, in my view, in the UK.
I'm Harold James, and thank you. That was really, really inspirational. I had a question about your plea for citizenship. Do you have a optimal size of the state that is implied in your notion of citizenship? Because if you think about the Greek story, it's a story about city-states. And the example that you start with of the United States is obviously an enormous country. China with bureaucratic authoritarianism is an enormous country. And democracy seems to work really well in quite small settings. Do you want to think about whether states can be too big or too small?
Yes, I do. Though, in fact, in the book, I've sort of finessed that. I think this is a fantastically important question. And it is obvious that if you look at the world today, the countries that we would regard as having the most successful and vital democracies are places, I think, like Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and indeed, they all have in common that they are small. Everybody, as it were, knows everybody else, and they feel profoundly bound to one another. So this raises a profound question, which I think the founding fathers of the US were very well aware of, which is why they created their federal constitution. Of course, given what they had to work with, they couldn't do much else, which is, can you make democracy work in very large countries? And I think it's a crucial part of my argument. You know, universal suffrage democracy has really been going 120 years. It depends on how close to universal suffrage you want to get before you think that it's, but certainly not more than 150 years or so. This is a very short period. And it is easy to argue that very special conditions allowed it to emerge and survive and thrive in the 20th century. And even then it was very fragile, as we know. It's just a fundamentally fragile system. So it seems to me that there is a very, very good question about how well we can run democracy in a huge country. The answers that the founding fathers seem to me to have given are broadly correct, in the sense maximum decentralization, provided each of the decentralized bit of it continues to operate as a functioning democracy. And to put it bluntly, in the case of America, that has never really happened because of the horrifying legacy of slavery. I mean, that's completely obvious. In a country like the UK, at least the England, because I think it is going to break up, so that supports your hypothesis, Scotland will leave. The England may be small enough geographically and homogeneous enough and feel itself sufficiently threatened by Europe, the rest of Europe, to remain united and democratic. But it's a genuinely interesting question. I tend to think it will, but for the US, recent developments in the 30s, as I've increasingly been reading them, what happened in the 30s. I have a section in my book on the accident of FDR. You could imagine another history. And what is happening now in the US does raise a profound question whether a state, a society, and a country this large, this diverse, in every possible dimension, can stick together with a sense of shared commitment as citizens, and therefore to the loyalty to shared institutions and processes that are involved in creating democracy in the long run. I think that is an absolutely core question, which the founding fathers unambiguously recognized. I spent quite a lot of time looking at the Federalist Papers in this recent years, Hamilton's work on the presidency, on the electoral college, all fascinating stuff. But I think it is a very real question. And certainly I wouldn't dream for a moment of going to China personally and say, we know how to do this, you try this. Anyway, they're not going to do it, which doesn't mean, coming back to where I said, I personally believe that this is simply the far and away and incomparably the best system for human flourishing, to use Ned Felt's wonderful phrase, human flourishing, which involves this symbiosis between individualism in the market and individuals working together in politics as citizens. And if that can't be done because our societies have become too big, complex, and diverse, to me, that's just a horrifying tragedy. And so this book, this work is a tiny, obviously irrelevant contribution to trying to keep this thing going. But I accept the argument and the concern very much.
So I think we may have one more question here, one last question.
Hi, I'm Sam Gray. Thank you so much for your speech. Really enjoyed it. It seemed throughout your speech you've been hinting at a best case scenario for the future of democratic capitalism and a possible worst case scenario. Essentially, whether leaders of liberal democracies do what is necessary to shore up capitalism. And I'm wondering, in your view, if leaders of liberal democracies are serious about doing that, what is the policy response that we will see from them in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I have 3 chapters on that. They're very long, and I think they're sort of, I've come to the view, I'm going to run them anyway. One of the people in this audience, Rob Johnson, has read every single one of them, and I'm very grateful to him for this. I think, and I don't have the time, I do discuss a lot of this, there isn't a package. And the reason for this, and I feel this even more strongly after the last 10 months in the US than I did when I wrote the book, that every country has its own history, nature, because of the scale point that Harold mentioned, so that what you can do to make things work are different in every case. And and I think the tragedy, to me, of the US, which is obviously what obsesses all non-American Democrats now, is that it needs most, I think, it needs more change than most of the others. I mean, comparable high-income democracies today. This wasn't true half a century, 60 years, 70, 80 years ago. But it is least capable of delivering it. Because the geniuses who created the Constitution were determined to prevent the government from being effective, and they have been remarkably successful. So it does seem to me that it is quite easy to produce a blueprint of the sort of things you'd probably want to see happen, which would make people feel more secure, more comfortable, less enraged, less committed to an endless cultural and culture-related internal war, culture plus ethnic internal war, than now. You can imagine those things that actually use the state to bind people together. But I don't see now how you can deliver it without a political revolution. If you think about the 30s, which I think was the last creative period of this kind, which sort of set up to my mind, a working template for a reformed capitalism. You can obviously differ. I mean, obviously some of the regulation was ridiculous and FDR did lots of ridiculous things, but nonetheless, it basically did that. I think it seems to me there was an immense amount of luck in what happened. In particular, the collapse of the economy in the early 30s was so colossal. The wipeout of the then most conservative elements in electoral politics was so colossal, so that the Democrats had this huge potential power position. And FDR was a very, very remarkable politician, even if he was somewhat tyrannical in some ways. Really remarkable politician, one of the greatest politicians in democracies that have ever existed. Well, that was all luck. It hasn't happened this time. I hoped it would happen in 2010, in 2008 and thereafter, but it didn't. So I don't see how you go from here to there. And perhaps the best answer there, and I won't go about all the other countries because there I think it's simpler to do this. Simpler, I'm not saying it will happen, it's simpler. But in the US, I've come to the view that it isn't impossible to imagine a set of policy proposals which would calm this anxiety, war, and so forth. It wouldn't be easy. But I can't see how the politics will do it. It will take political genius, it seems to me, and I don't see for the life of me where that's coming from. These may be the symptoms of a 75-year-old who's begun to suffer from the sins of the most prevailing sin of a 75-year-old, which is pervasive pessimism. But that's what I feel at the moment. It's not what I felt 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, if there are no other questions, Martin, thank you very, very much for this edifying and inspiring talk to us. Thanks again.
Great pleasure. And best of luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.